On June 16, 2015, video game juggernaut Square Enix did its annual E3 showcase to show off its upcoming games. And although 2015 was hardly the publisher's best showing, they did show off new trailers for some pretty heavy hitters. Rise of the Tomb Raider, Kingdom Hearts 3, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, and the reboot of Hitman were definitely the marquee titles. And smaller projects such as Star Ocean 5 and indie title I Am Setsuna rounded out the lineup alongside fan service releases such as Dragon Quest Heroes 2 and the chibi hell that is the world of Final Fantasy. And then of course, there was without a doubt the biggest crowd pleaser with the announcement that after decades of clamoring for it, Final Fantasy VII Remake was finally going to be a real thing. Of course, the reaction was huge, but even then, most gamers knew to temper their expectations with Square Enix, as a trailer without a release date could mean that there were still years left in development.
And as time went on, that was exactly the case, as the final game was just shy of 5 years away from release. But somehow, out of everything that was shown, there was something of a dark horse moment that unexpectedly stole the show.
Right after showing off Avalanche Studios' Just Cause 3, producer Yosuke Saito took to the stage and unveiled the first look of a follow-up to 2010's cult classic, Nier. At the time of this 2015 press event, the original game was still very much niche, a title that only the most ardent RPG and Square Enix fans had played. A game developed by Kaguya, best known for middling action games like Bullet Witch and Resident Evil spin-offs like Dead Aim and Umbrella Chronicles, and a game that sold a modest 400,000 copies over its lifetime. But this trailer showing off almost exclusively concept art and somber cuts from its upcoming soundtrack signaled to the fans that all of the right talent would be working on this sequel. Of course, there was Yosuke Saito, who was showing off the trailer, a legendary producer who had been in the industry since the early Enix days, who had worked on the original Nier, and who had become integral to Dragon Quest's continued success. The title was going to be developed by Platinum Games, which had already established itself time and time again as Japan's premier action game developer, with standouts like Bayonetta, Vanquish, and the incredible Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, with Takahisa Tara, one of the leads on MGR, taking up the reins for this upcoming Nier project. Keiichi Okabe would be reprising his role of composer, and for people in the know, this was always the hope, as the original game easily would have failed to make up even half of the impact that it did without his incredible soundtrack.
And then there was director Yoko Taro. Prior to this 2015 press conference, Yoko Taro was something of an enigma, a figure who had directed just a few niche games that were known for being both outlandish and brutal, but also games that had been incredibly resonant for those who locked in with what the director was doing.
But on June 16, 2015, in front of a large audience in attendance at the Los Angeles Convention Center and the larger video game audience tuning in online, Yoko Taro made his first mainstream appearance in the West, and arguably his biggest mainstream appearance ever.
Hello
everyone. I'm the director of the new project, Mr. Taro Yoko.
And as one can imagine, or maybe you remember it if you were following games coverage at the time, the internet went wild. Animated GIFs, memes, and tons of commentary. Suddenly, gamers everywhere were fascinated by the weird guy in the moon mask. Of course, fans of the original game knew that this mask was based on Emil, an important character from the first Nier, but the particulars didn't matter. This weird self-deprecating guy.
So, after hearing about the production of the new Nier project from Saito-san here, and then hearing we would be able to ask Platinum Games and character designer Akihiko Yoshida to contribute to the production, it feels like I really don't have anything I need to do here. But if I say things like that, then a lot of people are going to get angry at me.
He had absolutely stolen the show for, at the very least, the Square Enix press conference, and quite possibly the entire E3 event. And gamers had questions. Who was this guy? What was with the mask? Does he always wear it? What were his games like? And why for the love of God did he clap his hands like that? And with that appearance, with the announcement that Platinum Games would be working on the eventual Nier 2, suddenly for the first time in the director's career, there was some real pre-release buzz around one of his projects, and the cult audience that he had slowly built up over the decade prior was there for it.
A cult audience that I have been a proud member of since the 2004 US release of Drakengard.
When Nier Automata released in early 2017, the game hit the ground running. Reviews were glowing, sales were strong, the influencer sphere was incredibly supportive of the game, and tons of Rule 34 content of the game's protagonist 2B flooded the image boards. The game was nominated for tons of awards and won quite a few of them, and as of December 2024, Nier Automata and its eventual ports have sold over 9 million copies.
Automata was a big game, much larger than anyone had anticipated, and it was made fast and for not very much money.
Developed in just over 2 years fast, and although an official budget was never reported, estimates placed the total budget somewhere far below $20 million. The return on investment was massive, so much so that Hideki Kamiya, one of the founders of Platinum Games and director of more incredible titles than I care to get into right now, credited Yoko Taro with saving his studio with the success of Nier Automata. And the game's successes did not stop there, with Automata's protagonist 2B becoming such a hot commodity that even 10 years later, the character continues to show up for cameo appearances in other video games. And so with all of this wild success, as is natural in pretty much any franchise, there was a real knock-on effect. Automata gained Yoko Taro a ton of new fans, so naturally people started going backwards to check out his catalog and see what he was up to prior to this landmark event. But it should be stated that Nier Automata was something of a perfect storm, a perfect confluence of events at exactly the right time with exactly the right people to make it the hit that it was. But the road to Automata was a bumpy one, and the journey was anything but a straight line. And over the next couple of months, I hope to cover that journey in an ongoing Nier Automata retrospective, with this video acting as the first part.
So, if that's your kind of thing, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future uploads. And drop a like to help this video survive the meat grinder that is the YouTube algorithm.
Originally hired as a 3D CGI designer for Namco, Yoko Taro's earliest contributions to the gaming world were fairly modest, working as a background designer for arcade titles such as Alpine Racer 2 and Time Crisis 2. In 1999, he then worked for a now-defunct company called Sugar and Rockets Inc., where he worked as a planner on Chase the Express, known here in the West under the far inferior moniker of Covert Ops Nuclear Dawn, a game that borrowed heavily from titles like Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil in a largely generic but ambitious action title. And then Sugar and Rockets was eventually purchased by Sony, where Taro worked on the Japanese exclusive Phase Paradox as a designer. About a year after that purchase though, Taro ended up landing a job at Kaguya after being dismissed from Sony, and it would just so happen that it was here where the Yoko Taro we know today was formed.
But instead of this being a story about a plucky upstart artist climbing the corporate ladder on his way to becoming the auteur that he is today, instead, Taro's ascent was one born out of convenience, publisher meddling, being in the right place at the right time, and competition in the marketplace, as well as the subtle, okay then, well, fuck you spirit that has come to define much of his career.
In 1999, prior to Kaguya's creation, founder and Namco alumni Takuya Iwasaki, fresh off directing Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, had a drink with Enix producer Takamasa Shiba, and naturally, with the liquor flowing, the two started spitballing different game ideas. But with one of the two men fresh off of an arcade flight sim and the other working to get role-playing games made, the two started discussing what it would be like to make a fantasy-inspired flight simulator. One where the player piloted a dragon instead of an F-16, and one where Sidewinder missiles were replaced with Dragonfire. In March of 2000, Iwasaki resigned from Namco before striking out to found Kaguya, and many of his colleagues from his prior company jumped ship with him in order to set out into the ugly world of contract work, locking down a soccer sim for Enix, which was released in 2002, and a Japanese exclusive One Piece game for the Game Boy Advance shortly after. The new studio's next two games would be the Capcom contracted Resident Evil Dead Aim, and then finally, for the sake of this video, the Enix, square-enix by the time of this game's final release, contracted Drakengard, or Dragon Dragoon as it was released in Japan. With Iwasaki busy with the brand new company and taking on as much contract work as he could get, the dev found himself stretched to his breaking point. Originally self-appointed to direct Drakengard, Iwasaki had to limit his involvement in order to get Dead Aim done, all while taking on roles for games like Last Rose and Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. And it was in this plate spinning where Iwasaki made the choice to quickly promote Yoko Taro up the ranks before assigning him to his first lead position as director and scenario designer for Drakengard. And with the new lead selected for the project, the rest of the team fell in line. Iwasaki co-produced the game with Takamasa Shiba, who at this point had aided in multiple games, but who was probably best known at this time with assisting in the production of Valkyrie Profile. Sawako Notori, writer on R4, Ridge Racer Type 4, and Tales of Destiny 2, was brought on to aid Taro in the writing process. Himihiko Fujisaka was brought on board for character design in one of their earlier roles, later going on to be a constant in aiding Taro in his projects, but also contributing over the years to Mistwalker on multiple projects, as well as Nintendo with their work on the Fire Emblem series. Yosuke Saito, who at this point had already aided on Dragon Warrior 3 and Tomb Raider 3 for Enix, was brought on as executive producer just as his role was becoming more and more defined before becoming the absolute heavy that he is today within Square Enix. Nobuyoshi Sano was made the project's composer after making his name and creating sounds and music for both Tekken and Ridge Racer, and finally Akira Yasui took on the role of head designer, which after working on projects like Resident Evil Dead Aim and Phase Paradox, saw the programmer taking on his most ambitious role to date. And so with the team formed, they went to work on what was internally being called Project Dragonsphere, a mashup of Dragon and Electrosphere, which had served as this game's template since the beginning. And this crew started in earnest on creating the Dragon meets Ace Combat design that Iwasaki had inadvertently pitched to Enix years before. There was only one problem though. With Kaguya essentially working as a gun for hire, keeping the publishers happy no matter how crazy their demands was always going to be the name of the game. Enix wanted Dragonsphere in order to compete with Namco's Ace Combat, and now they had a team assembled by the creator of the acclaimed third entry in that series. But as development was underway, Enix wanted to enter into another market simultaneously. A flight sim would be nice, but there was another franchise that was making way too much money to be ignored. And that was Omega Force's cash cow, Shin Sengoku Musou, or as it is known here in the West, Dynasty Warriors. Just as Dragonsphere was getting off the ground and the flight sim nature of the game was being ironed out, producer Takamasa Shiba cornered the team and pressured the developers into changing the scope of the title. And before long, Kaguya and Taro were forced to take this project that up until this point had only been centered around Dragonflight and take it back to the ground level with action sequences that would see the player fighting hundreds of infantrymen with the option of seamlessly cutting back into the skies. And it is really here where everything changed. Not just for what Drakengard would ultimately be, but the tone and trajectory of Yoko Taro's storytelling for years to come. Morale in the team was at an all-time low. Everyone had signed up and put in work on a game that was now completely different from what they had previously agreed to make. And although there was plenty of staff at Kaguya who had previously worked on Ace Combat, including Iwasaki, Kaguya had no experience in making Musou games. And to make matters even worse, Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies released for the PS2 during the development of Drakengard, ushering in the beginning of what fans of the series have since dubbed the golden era of that franchise, with the 3 PS2 entries often being cited as the absolute best for that long-running series. And while Drakengard was being developed, Omega Force really started churning out the Dynasty Warriors titles, iterating on the formula by releasing Dynasty Warriors 3, an expansion to 3 called Extreme Legends, and even the 4th entries in the franchise, all while Kaguya was trying to play catch-up with the earliest entries. And with competition in both markets ultimately serving as the very reason for Project Dragonsphere's existence, changes were requested throughout the development process whenever it felt like this project was falling behind, and publisher meddling became more of a feature of the development process for this game than a bug. So let's just for 1 second try to put ourselves in the director's shoes. He came into the industry as a CG artist, found work with an upstart company after being let go from a previous layoff, and then when working on what was supposed to be a title in the wheelhouse of the founder of Kaguya, suddenly found himself as the lead on that project, a project which continuously became the victim of feature creep, all while Taro was leading staff who were already frustrated about having to develop something that was straying further and further from the original vision by the day. Make Ace Combat, scratch that, make Ace Combat meets Dynasty Warriors, but be sure to innovate. Make the flying good, but you need to be able to fight on the ground. But then, with the push of a button, you need to be able to get back on your dragon. And Drakengard was being made for a publisher that is known for making RPGs after all, so the story needs to cater to that crowd, and for good measure, it'd be a good idea if you leaned into Dungeons & Dragons territory. But don't be too generic with it, make something that stands out. And it was in those conditions that Taro and Notori set to writing the scenario and script. But as the world would soon find out, Taro was anything but your standard storyteller. And although Drakengard is hardly his finest work, It is here where the seeds were sown for his unique style of world building. When tasked with incorporating the Dynasty Warrior style action, Taro reportedly found himself at a bit of a loss. A single warrior tasked with slaughtering countless enemies in order to realize their goal, hundreds if not thousands dead by the time the credits would roll. And while Dynasty Warriors was raucous in its carnage, featuring anime-styled protagonists spouting heroics all while Japanese butt rock blared on in the background and kill counts were treated as a badge of honor, Taro found this whole idea to be farcical. What type of person could kill that many people and maintain any type of normalcy or humanity? All of that bloodshed, all of that destruction, and that agony. And how perverse was it for a game to delight in that type of violence and then try to present the protagonist as a hero instead of a mass murderer? No, when filtered through Taro's mind, a world like that could only produce those suffering through varying levels of madness. And so early on, that became the tonal direction for Drakengard. A violent game in a violent world where morals were abandoned in order to justify the continued bloodshed. Less shonen and more pitch black fantasy. And that revelation colored everything. The plot would be sour and disquieting, a world at the brink of an apocalypse being ushered in by those who had been misshapen by this cruel world to the point where they only sought to destroy it, characters who had been perverted by atrocities that had become commonplace, a main character who was a sadist whose tendencies were more marked by sociopathy than heroics, good men corrupted into betraying their best friends and loved ones after being slighted by circumstance. This was to be a world where cannibals would end up in your party, where child soldiers were forced to fight only to be slaughtered at the hands of the player, where sexual assault against minors was a fact of life, and even taboo subjects such as incest weaved themselves into the plot. And surprisingly, a game with this type of storytelling made it off the cutting room floor, partially because the bleak tone catered to a more mature audience, and as a result stood apart from a genre which usually settled on narratives of young people saving the world through the power of friendship. But also through oversight and some borderline trickery. When the game was starting to take its brutal and twisted shape, Taro became increasingly worried that Drakengard would struggle to get approval by Sony, or at the very least would have to be heavily censored, and it is here where Yosuke Saito steps in. As the story goes, Saito decided that the best time to seek approval would be when the executives were not on their A game. So instead of scheduling a typical meeting, Saito waited until the tail end of E3 prior to release in order to pitch the game and its content when the higher-ups were already exhausted and preoccupied with all of the wheeling and dealing that came from the busy event. Saito reportedly met with them, downplayed the content in the game, gave vague details, and then used his goodwill as an important producer within one of Sony's biggest partners, all while telling a very abridged version of what was going to be in the title. And the gambit worked. Drakengard was greenlit, where a more straightforward and honest approach may have led to the game being reworked on yet again. And so, despite all of the hurdles and struggles through development, Dragon Dragoon was released on September 11th, 2003. And as such, it was one of the first major games published after the monumental merger that resulted in Squaresoft and Enix becoming the square-enix of today. And then about half a year later, the game was then released in the US in March of the following year. If you dig around the internet for reviews, the typical sentiment for Drakengard is story cool, gameplay bad. And while there certainly is a lot of truth to that reductive statement, it is kind of missing the point. Drakengard is the type of game that is the way that it is because of the circumstances that it was born out of. And it is also the way that it is because of the team who made it and their frustrations with the development. I think a more accurate way of putting it is this. Most of the time, Drakengard is not a fun game, but it is a deeply impactful piece of interactive art. First, let's just get it out of the way. This was supposed to be Ace Combat meets Dynasty Warriors, and even at the time of release, Drakengard simply could not compete with Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies or Dynasty Warriors 4 in terms of raw gameplay. The Dragonflight is totally serviceable, a mix between flight mechanics seen in Namco's flagship series and Team Andromeda's and then Smilebit's Panzer Dragoon series. Not quite on rails like all the games who share their lineage with Sega's Space Harrier, but much smaller in scope than Ace Combat's Ocean of Blue Sky. Drakengard does not hit the highs of either, but it does get the job done. Movement is smooth and responsive, defensive options like strafing air dashes and quick turns make flying around a breeze to control, and offensive actions such as manual and locked-on projectiles make for frenetic dogfighting, while powerful magic attacks offer up devastating screen-clearing potential. You fight against airships and zeppelins, dragons and cyclopses, and then the game gets stranger as it progresses, fighting gargoyles, reapers, and, eventually, the flying and air combat in Drakengard is solid enough, possibly solid enough to have carried an entire game, even though it could never compare to the silky smooth mechanics of Shattered Skies, which even today still feels incredible. But it is really when you are on foot that Drakengard is simultaneously at its worst as far as actually playing the game is concerned, but somehow at its best tonally. Because of the change of focus during development, the quote-unquote grand battles, which by the time of release take up the vast majority of playtime in Drakengard, they are a droning slog by most accounts. You hack and slash like you would in any Dynasty Warriors game, making your way through throngs of enemies on your way to each level's targets, but Drakengard is devoid of both the mechanical refinement present in Omega Force's best-selling franchise, and much of the pomp and circumstance surrounding Dynasty Warriors' power fantasy presentation. In DW, attack strings can hit hard and have a healthy amount of magnetism to make sure that you are always clearing the screen of multiple enemies at once while nearly all of your attacks find their target. Musou attacks are flashy and devastating ways of screen wiping that offer up iframes in order to punctuate successful bouts or as effective get the fuck off me options when the game decides to push back. Drakengard's combat, on the other hand, feels slippery and loose, with most weapons boasting a severe lack of range, feeling absolutely stubby in a lot of encounters, and then without those wide hurt boxes in Namco's games, you will often find yourself repeatedly missing your target by a hair. And although there are jumping attacks and dashing attacks to round out the fighting, the jump attack feels floaty and inexact, even though because of their fast attack speed and potential for juggling, you may find yourself combating against the game's poor controls to chase damage and take advantage of the more lumbering weapons as they function much faster when airborne. And the dash attacks, while effective for dealing good burst damage and securing knockdowns, they too can suffer from the same a swing and a miss slipperiness that characterizes much of this game's combat. But there is also the added frustration that comes from the required momentum needed to do one of these attacks. Basically, you start at a brisk jog, and eventually holding the left stick will accelerate to a run, at which point you can execute dash attacks. But because of this game's horrible draw distance, which is not so convincingly masked by a fog of war effect, you will often find yourself in situations where enemies pop in right at the moment where you have to flip a coin. Am I going to make it up to full speed at the time that I release this attack? Or am I going to lose all momentum, or worse, get hit in the process of delaying it until the run animation kicks up? It can be frustrating. But then there is also the camera. The camera is not your friend in Drakengard. You have very little manual control over it. In the air, everything is smooth. You can flick the right stick in order to peek over your shoulders, or you can use a shoulder button to keep your perspective locked on your target. But the camera is typically automatically adjusting itself to keep the perspective locked behind the player. But when it comes to the on-foot stuff, it feels like they applied a camera system that was originally born out of those flight controls, and then just tried to kind of make it work for infantry sections. Flicking the right stick still allows for a quick pan, and the camera still wants to stay trained on the player character's back, but it is tied to your movement in a weird way. When you are swinging your weapon willy-nilly, the camera stays locked in at the same perspective as it was when you first started moving the left analog stick, keeping that as a reference point. So you will often find yourself staring at the combat from all sorts of bizarre angles as you swing. And it is only once you release the stick that the camera will then play catch-up and return to its default position. So, in practice, you will either have to return the stick to neutral mid-combat, giving up positioning, or you will have to tap the guard button, which will get you back to neutral, but again you are giving up the offensive. And even the dodge roll can lead to further disorientation, as it seems to be modeled after the Dragon's air strafe. But on the ground, the camera seems to have a bias towards the closest enemies when completing a dodge, making for camera swings so wild and so confusing that I often find myself opting to forego the option entirely. But as bad as all of that can sound when describing it, in practice, it all feels just on the wrong side of average for action games like this at the time that it was released. And every once in a while, there is a glimmer of hope within this game's combat system. There are mechanics such as combo enders, which can punctuate attack strings after a certain amount of strikes, with more and more becoming unlockable as weapons are upgraded, offering up something of a rhythm in early sections of the game, and eventually powerful crowd control skills. And then there is a decent degree of experimentation to be had with this game's eventual selection of 65 weapons that can be found throughout the game. And while none of them are revolutionary in their basic swings, with differences really only being found in their range and heft, every weapon does have its own unique set of combo enders, but more importantly, its own magic attack. Some are basic like fireballs and ground pounds, and some are far more interesting such as Strider-like Ouroboros attacks, geysers of highly damaging frost, or even the ability to speed up your run speed to a ridiculous degree. And in a very welcome design choice, every spell does offer up several initial iframes in order to clear enemies and turn the tides whenever more firepower is needed. And when coupled with this game's weapon wheel feature, up to 10 weapons can be equipped in a quiver of sorts, making sure that at least in theory, you always have the right tool for the right job at exactly the right moment. And then there is a pretty neat combo system that incentivizes effective play. Hack away without too much time between hits passing, and your combo count will continuously rise. And since this game does boast an interesting collision model, all characters collaterally nicked by a swing are factored toward that hit count. And whenever the combo ends, resources are then tallied based on your performance. EXP bonuses that can really add up, and after certain counts, orbs that will drop from fallen enemies that can reward the player with health drops, and orbs that can detonate after being picked up for burst damage and screen clearing. But in this little mini game of trying to keep your hit tally climbing, there are a few quirks. It should be said that the rewards of extra health and experience are so important to leveling up and staying alive effectively. And this game is not hard, but with all of the quirks in its mechanics, you will take far more stray hits than you would expect, and without potions or life-stealing mechanics or health regen, these orbs are your only way of healing. So these rewards in a lot of cases can lead to what feels like suboptimal combat decisions. In Drakengard, your hit counter is tallied by physical weapon strikes. Magic does not factor in, unless the spell that you have has a lockdown mechanic, often making those some of the best in the game. So with all that being the case, you will often find yourself topped off on MP, able to deal a massive AoE attack, but using it will put you in a wind-up animation that will kill off your counter. And guarding also takes more time than it should and cannot simply be tapped to parry like modern games. So often the best way to play this game if you are leaning into the RPG mechanics or min-maxing is to swing away Caution Be Damned until you are nicked and then go into your blinking recovery animation that offers up precious iframes, and then hoping you can swing another attack off to keep the counter alive. That is, unless you get hit with a knockdown attack over and over again, killing your count for good. And then there is the issue of the 65 unlockable weapons. Every single one of them starts off at level 1, where they do pitiful damage and have short combo strings. So you will often find yourself spamming the same couple of swings over and over again in hopes of leveling them up enough to actually become useful later on. But instead of weapons growing with experience, they level up, gain abilities, and even change forms only through hitting specific kill counts with each weapon. Later upgrades requiring hundreds of kills in order to hit the next level. And so again, this is suboptimal, because unless you are going to grind out the earliest levels in the game over and over again in order to keep parity with your new weapons, instead you will be hitting progressively more powerful enemies with your weak level 1 weapons over and over again in order to feed them enough blood to become useful down the line. And finally, there is the fact that while your character levels up after every battle, leveling only affects your health and your magic pool. You can take more hits and you can fire off more spells, but there are no bonuses to strength, speed, or defense stats. So attack strength is intrinsically tied to your weapon stats and your weapon stats alone, offering no reprieve from this grind. All in all, Drakengard's ground combat works, but it is a little underwhelming and undercooked, and at times frustrating and a little crazy making, but more on that in a bit. And the levels and battles themselves also fail to impress a lot of the time due to the bevy of technical problems. I've already mentioned the draw distance and sudden pop-in of the enemies, which even back in 2004 was quite a bit behind what other games in the genre were doing, and especially Dynasty Warriors 4. But again, a lot of this can be tied to how this game streams in data, not only for the battlegrounds on foot, but also for Drakengard's key gimmick. While it certainly may have been enough to have the game divided into two different types of levels, the flight sections and the on-foot sections, if Drakengard had any type of innovation, it was the ability to take to the skies on your dragon with a push of a button mid-battle. And the game does that, well, at least in theory. While you definitely can take to the skies at a moment's notice, there are often choke points within levels where no such action can take place. Whether it is a loading or collision issue, you can typically only do it in large open areas, with some levels introducing narrative excuses to prohibit the action and others being indoors away from the dragon's domain. And while it definitely is a neat feature, and it can make getting around some of the larger levels a breeze, there are a few caveats. First, while flying in the dragon exclusive stages, flight feels responsive and nimble. You have access to more than enough evasive maneuvers and can even get the upper hand on fast-moving threats. But in these action stages, your red dragon is a giant sitting duck just begging to be shot down by archers and mages. And these enemies, they do not miss. Straight up hit scanning aim. And then later levels introduce red enemy types, typically the same as the enemies that you've been fighting before, but red. And these guys are immune to magic and reflect spells, and most notably, Dragonfire right back at you. So even though there definitely are levels where the game is practically begging you to take to the skies and rain down the flames, the vast majority of these levels will force you back to the ground more often than not, relegating the dragon to more of a fantasy mount for limited transportation and style points than the equivalent of a medieval Hornet fighter jet. And then arguably, most important for looking at how Drakengard failed to deliver the medieval Dynasty Warriors experience, Omega Force, even if it is far from perfect, always managed to pack each stage with enough combatants on either side of the conflict. And even though these were just armies of copy-pasted ancient Chinese dudes, this dynamic always went quite a long way in making these large-scale battles feel convincing, even if their behaviors on the field were pretty basic. Drakengard has no such dynamic. It is just you versus hundreds of copy-pasted soldiers, knights, ogres, mages, archers, and stuff that I will get into in a minute. Just you, largely empty environments against constantly popping in hordes of enemies. And if I left it all there, it would be pretty easy to write Drakengard off as a bad game. Because when it is compared to other titles of the time, especially the ones it was tasked with competing with, it kind of is, at least mechanically. But it really isn't as simple as all of that. Despite its shortcomings, Drakengard sold nearly 500,000 copies over its lifetime. And even though the reviews at the time made no attempt to gloss over its flaws, the title did still net itself scores that were slightly above average. And that is simply because of the fact that while what you are doing in Drakengard is potentially lackluster, why you were doing it, and everything that surrounded the action was wild, interesting, subversive, and in a lot of ways, ahead of its time. And keep in mind from this point on, there will be spoilers for this entire game. But if you haven't played it over the last 20 years, that's kind of on you. For the uninitiated, Drakengard takes place in the dark fantasy realm of Midgard, not to be confused with Final Fantasy VII's town of Midgar, or the realm in which humans lived in Norse mythology. Interested in people, their histories, and their motivations to carry out atrocities, Taro originally wanted to place the events of Drakengard in an alternate version of medieval Europe. Originally, countries were going to retain their real-world namesakes and would share characteristics with their real-life counterparts. But worried about how that may be received, the publisher pressured Taro to change this decision. Instead, the countries were given generic fantasy aliases such as the Land of Mountains, Land of Sands, Land of Seas, and so on. But even though the alternate history was largely scrapped from the final version, the map of Midgard as portrayed in Drakengard and its sequels is literally a map of Europe flipped upside down. At the time of the events of Drakengard, Midgard is in a constant state of war, and two armies are battling over control of the land. The powerful Empire, with its vast numbers, near-limitless resources, and ties to magical powers which they use to augment their brutality, and in their way is the Union, which is made up of hundreds of small provinces and nations who seek to maintain their sovereignty. But the central conflict here is apocalyptic. As of the events of Drakengard, the world is protected from cataclysm by mystical seals which stave off otherworldly beings known as the Watchers in English, or as the Tenchi, or angels in Japanese. Creatures which would serve the gods in destroying humanity. And it just so happens that the Empire is composed of religious fanatics and are currently aligning with the cult of the Watchers. Cultist zealots who seek to bring on Armageddon by destroying the protective seals and then destroying the final seal, which currently resides in a woman selected by happenstance who is now referred to as the goddess. Drakengard starts at the onset of this conflict and progresses as the cult gets closer and closer to realizing its final goal. After watching the menu cutscene and getting a feel for what this game's dark tone entails, the first mission sees our protagonist, Kaim, storming the battlefield surrounding the goddess's sanctuary. The Empire has decided to go straight for the jugular and wishes to stamp out the living seal as its opening salvo. Carrion birds circle the blood-soaked land below as Kaim cuts down soldier after soldier, accompanied by violent spurts of blood, all while the invading army lays siege to the goddess Firiai's bastion. The opening CG cutscene is violent, bombastic, and grim. And all while the carnage plays out, we are bombarded with our first real taste of this game's cacophonous soundtrack.
Pretty eye.
During development, once the dark fantasy theme was nailed down, and while the alternate history timeline was being written and fleshed out alongside the core theme of madness, composers Nobuyoshi Sano and Takayuki Aihara started the work of developing the soundscape for Drakengard at the behest of producer Takamasa Shiba. Given the game's dark nature and anachronistic setting, Shiba wanted a soundtrack that could be considered classically sophisticated while leaning into the core theme of insanity. And as a result, Sano and Aihara worked together to make something unlike any video game soundtrack ever heard before, or possibly ever again. As far as making something classically sophisticated was concerned, Aihara decided to steal from the best by isolating phrases and samples from famous classical composers. Compositions by Stravinsky, Tchaikovsky, Mozart, and Debussy were selected for their grandiose and bombastic nature, and then the selections were turned over to Sano, where the theme of insanity was fully explored. Sano, best known for arranging music for Tekken and Ridge Racer, took these famous samples and then proceeded to chop and screw them to hell and back. Taking world-renowned phrases, cutting them, looping them, using reverse playback, all with little regard to harmony and even time signatures, turning beautiful music into something droning and panicked. Music that was once instantly recognizable, now turned into a bizarre hellscape through the use of a computer. And it is to his and Aihara's butchering, restructure, and then somehow incredibly rearranged version of Hungarian composer Bela Bartok's The Miraculous Mandarin, now transformed into the disquieting track named after his appearance in the game, Chapter 1 on the Ground. It is to this soundscape that we get to witness Kaim, a young former prince from a neighboring kingdom to the goddess's castle, slake his bloodlust as he tries to defend the human seal. A young woman named Firiai, who, prior to being transformed into a literal final hope for humanity, was once Kaim's sister. But in Kaim's savagery, the young man drops his defenses in order to take the lives of others when he is gravely wounded from behind. And it is here where we get to finally play Drakengard for the first time. We play as a mortally wounded Kaim in the middle of a losing battle as he is trying to get to Firiai while life is draining from his body. But in order to get there, he has to continue doing the one thing that it seems that he is still good at in this world, and that is kill. So set to the duos, pounding bass drums, crashing cymbals, relentless snares, and stinging strings, we set to cutting our way toward the castle's keep. And when all of this is firing up at the same time, this is where I have to reinvestigate everything that I've told you up until this point about Drakengard's gameplay and lack of technical prowess. Yes, when we are analyzing what it feels to play Drakengard by comparing it to Dynasty Warriors, this game can feel sloppy and a little unruly. But in this depressing world, in this hopeless struggle for survival, playing as this bloodthirsty young man who maniacally grins as he cuts people down and splatters the ground with blood so thick that it comes out black, here with the music assaulting you relentlessly, Drakengard's shortcomings start to come across as intentional to a certain point. Of course, this is a chicken and the egg problem, but the tone for this game was established in frustration and anger by a team being forced to make something outside of their scope with limited time and budget as constant reworks were forced upon them. And in practice, you can feel that while playing this game. Killing in Drakengard is mechanical, routine, and unceremonious. You slash through enemy after enemy, incentivized by this game's mechanics to keep up your pace, not even stopping to defend or even to think too deeply about what you are doing, and combo strings become executive and routine to the point of mundanity. And while Dynasty Warriors would constantly employ positive reinforcement with flashing KO counts, and that's because the Western version of the game did everything it could to sanitize the violence, blazing guitar riffs, shouts and cheers from faraway allied officers, and voice lines from larger-than-life anime protagonists, Kime's struggle represents everything that is grotesque about what the game is having you simulate. Kill counts are ticked away with the image of a crow pecking, driving home the imagery of slain combatants being picked apart by scavengers after being left to rot, and you take to the killing as one would set about mowing the grass. And the game's settings and mechanics almost seem like it is daring you to find the fun in its debauchery. But I do not say all of this to defend this game in some highfalutin manner. If you are the type of gamer that wants to sit back and feel good every time that you make hot shit happen on the screen, there is no contest between Drakengard and the game that it was made to compete with. Dynasty Warriors is mindless fun that rewards you with new items, characters, and weapons for knocking out wave after wave of flesh pinatas thrown your way to make you feel like an unstoppable hero. And it is being done by not only the studio who more or less invented the genre, but it was also doing it at a time when it was still new and exciting. A time where seeing that KO count rack up felt novel and exhilarating. Drakengard's violence only rewards you with the promise that you will have to do it again and again. And as the game goes on and the Empire and the Cult of the Watchers continues to succeed in their quest, it is an empty promise that anyone paying attention will recognize as only having the potential to end in failure and misery. Dynasty Warriors is popcorn, a game that you can easily attach the descriptor of fun to without even questioning it. Drakengard is challenging to the player in the way that all subversive art is. It is off-putting and challenging, it is equal parts train wreck and spectacle, it is jank and experimental, feeling more like the noise genre of music that its composer fell into than a beautifully crafted orchestral symphony. But Drakengard does make you contend with what it is asking you to do. What type of world is this? And in short, it makes you think about humanity and its continued violence. And everything else here in Drakengard is only there to emphasize this point. After your first mission, after you've successfully stormed the castle like an HVAC repairman on January 6th, Kime is confronted with what he hates most in this world, and in a lot of ways a reminder of what transformed him from a naive prince into the sociopath that he has become. Shot down by the Empire and chained to the ground in the middle of the castle's courtyard is a dying red dragon. In a momentary flashback, we are shown that Kime's mother and father were murdered by an Imperial Black Dragon in front of him when he was a young boy, being eaten in front of Kime in a sequence that may or may not have inspired one of the more gnarly sequences of Attack on Titan. Standing over the tortured beast, Kime immediately wants revenge. Not against this dragon in particular, but against the species in general. But after nearly succumbing to his injuries and the dragon on death's door as well, Kime calls out for a pact. A ritual between man and beast that binds their two souls together and can save both from the brink of death. A ritual that results in Kime gaining supernatural strength, as well as connecting the two's lives together until the end.
Answer. A pact or death. We are united by our need to live. Well? Yes, a pact.
Because once a pact is created, the two partners' mortality is tied to the other. If one dies, the death of the other will be immediately after. But for a human to call a pact with a beast, there must be a sacrifice. In almost an arbitrary manner, something is stripped from the human involved, and in the case of Kime, it is his ability to speak. A brand singed into his tongue denoting what he has given up in order to survive. And it should be stated that while Fleet Cooper, the English voice actor for Kime, who has done some TV acting and voice work for games like Suikoden, Grandia 3, and funnily enough, Ace Combat Zero, The Belkan War, while his performance is completely serviceable for the English dub, Kime is a much more effective character in service of this game's themes once he is mute. From this point on, the only creature who is capable of interpreting Kime's feelings and intentions and giving them words is the Red Dragon. A dragon who we'll eventually learn is named Angelus, who is voiced by Mona Marshall, a voice actress who is probably best known for her role of Sheila Broflovsky from South Park. And once the pact has been made, we as the player really only have the words of Angelus to rely on as far as our point of view exposition is concerned. We still see Kaim's bloodthirsty actions play out, but it is only through her questions and criticisms as well as the cries of his victims that we get any real insight into what this man is thinking. And again, I think this works, making the character transition more and more into an agent of death and destruction as the game trudges forward. From the moment that the pact is formed and Kaim is able to rescue Furii with the help of his friend and rival Inuart, the actual plot to this game is pretty straightforward. The Empire is still seeking to destroy all the seals, and as they march toward the end of the world, they leave nothing but death and destruction in their wake. And over time, the cult gains more power, and the soldiers in the Empire's army begin to succumb to a strange disease which makes them violent and unthinking, all while turning each victim's eyes red and their voices low and alien, chanting cult-like phrases over and over again.
Watcher's goddess, Watcher's goddess, Watcher's goddess, Watcher's goddess.
And through the events of Drakengard, it always seems like the Empire is one step ahead of you and your crew as the events play out. And as you try to stave off the attacks on each of these seals, Angelus is always aware of the presence of other pact partners which she has some sort of mythical connection to. So the game plays out over excursions to meet up with others, grow your ranks, and protect your sister, all while trying to stop the collapse of the world. But as far as growing your ranks goes, first we meet Leonard. And right away, Drakengard makes it clear that it isn't going to be pulling any punches with its characters, in what has to be the most cursed blunt rotation of all time. After seeking refuge in an elven village, a village which you soon find has already been burned to the ground by the Empire on their way to capture the land of the Forest Seal, Angelus detects Leonard, who has just entered a pact with a fairy. Prior to this joining, Leonard was currently at the edge of killing himself after seeing the butchered remains of his younger brothers killed by the Empire. Prior to this invasion, Leonard had taken his brothers with him to move far away from people, after his own parents had been killed in the ongoing war. And he also sought isolation due to his own proclivities. Leonard chose to be a hermit in order to protect his family and to hide away from his desires. And even though it was ultimately toned down by the time of both the Japanese and Western releases of this game, key lines of dialogue strongly hint, if not outright confirm, his depravity. Leonard is a pedophile who lusts after young boys. And now, everything having been lost, the murder of his brothers was one of the reasons that he sought death at the time that we are introduced to this character. But there was another reason, and it is the deep shame that came from him succumbing to his urges on the night that his hovel was invaded. Leonard had left his brothers alone at home while he went out into the forest to give in to his own desires, and when he came back, it was already too late. Sensing the distress at the time of his attempt, a fairy attracted to the emotional turmoil within Leonard chided and convinced the man to enter into a pact. And at this time, Leonard gave up his sight as the cost for entering into the contract, shielding himself from having to see the bodies of his brothers, but also punishing himself from ever being able to lust after young boys in the same way that he had before. Next, we meet Vertile, who is a key guardian and advisor to the goddesses, and as such, he plays the role of the Despicable Elder, a character who is there to dole out exposition and keep the plot moving, but this character, despite his position of importance, is a coward, and potentially senile as well, known for putting his own survival ahead of everything else, and he also seems to be the most openly bigoted when it comes to his opinions on the magical beasts that we encounter in this game.
So many subhuman soldiers. We would do well to kill as many as we can, Kaim.
A scummy character, to be sure, but when it comes to the rest of the cast, he might be one of the more benign. And the cost for his pact was easily the most trivial. Vertile, who entered a pact with an ancient dragon who was entering a petrified state as it was starting a great sleep, was able to take on the powerful beast's powers, and all it cost him was his hair. I guess the dude was very fond of it, but as far as prices go, it's the one I'd probably be willing to pay. And then we've got the craziest and most tragic of them all. Ariosh, an elf woman who was originally a dutiful housewife, was forced to watch her son and husband be slaughtered in front of her, and the event broke her mind. And after forming a pact with the fire and water elementals Salamander and Undine, which cost Ariosh her fertility, the young elf was pushed further to the edge, becoming violent and delusional, killing men and women, and then eating children under the twisted fantasy that she would somehow be able to keep them safe inside of her body. There are a few other characters to discuss, but I will circle back to them in a second. But this is the simple ebb and flow of the story. Go to a location where the next seal is, at which point Angelus will sound off about a new potential party member, pick them up, then go try to stop the Empire. But given Kaim's sociopathic nature, it is never done in the name of protecting the realms that are being attacked, and solely on wherever his anger is taking him. Sometimes going as far as to make matters worse for each realm when he comes onto the scene. Sometimes actively participating in atrocities while trying to seek vengeance. During the invasion of the Land of Forests, conscripted children soldiers are unleashed onto the Union. But to Kaim, there is no difference between the Empire's army and the children who were forced to fight alongside it. And so you cut them down while the music drones on in a sickening fashion. The same mechanical cruelty as it ever is in this game, all while Angelus laments on how awful a species humanity is, and all while Leonard cries and protests.
Please, help us! No! Help me.
I cannot raise my weapon against such children.
Someone help me! We've done the wrong!
His intense reactions to the act blurring the lines between his typical good nature and his perversions. And I don't know how necessary it is to point this out, but this is crazy. I've never played a game like this. Killing children in this nature is something I've never seen done before, or since, and Jesus Christ. And then there is what I think might be the most grim mission, a mission that takes place in the sky while on Dragonback. Kaim spots the Empire's navy. Taken hostage by the Empire, and then prosecuted, the Empire set to drowning all of the elves aboard their warships. The women and children were not to be spared. But rather than attempt to help, Kaim instead focuses on destroying the boats and killing the Empire's soldiers, only aiding in what is ultimately genocide without caring whose blood is on his hands. And with the corpses of children washing up on the shore, it is Ariosh who finds the most delight in this heinous act, eating the corpses of the children that wash up.
Ariosh! Surely not the children!
If there is an antagonist to this story, because no one is good here, the role belongs to Mana. Only 6 years old at the time of the events in Drakengard, Mana had been raised by her abusive mother with her twin brother Sire. Sire was doted upon by their mother, while Mana was neglected, denied affection, and subjected to her mother's fury. Her parents were from a tribe of golem sorcerers who lived in the Land of Mountains, and with their magic powers, they were able to control the stone giants who they lived alongside. But when the twins were born, one inherited this gift, and the other didn't. One was loved, and the other one more or less cast aside. Her mind warped and broken by this constant abuse, Mana was a weakened target, and her mind was easily corrupted by the influence of the Watchers, and she was later fully possessed. Now serving as a human puppet within Midgard, Mana was promoted to the role of head priestess of the Cult of the Watchers and leader of the Empire. She spreads the red eye disease amongst her subjects, making her army ruthless and obedient, and she is the main agent behind all of the attacks on the seals. Her twin brother Sire, on the other hand, was a relatively well-adjusted young boy, even if he did feel guilty for Mana's treatment. His sister having left their family under the spell of the Watchers, Sire lived with his family until their land was invaded by the Empire. With Sire left alone and forced to form a pact with a golem. The golem would protect the young boy and grant him powers as long as he gave up his time, meaning that until the 6-year-old died, he would remain forever 6. Sire is the last member of your group to join in, and somehow no one seems to make too big of a deal of you mixing company with a child abuser, and a psychotic woman who thinks the safest thing that they can do with Sire is eat them. As the final seals are breaking, two important things are happening. Inuart, Kaim's best friend, who was originally betrothed to Firiai before she was chosen to become the next goddess of the seal, was captured by the Cult of the Watchers, and once in captivity, Inuart was corrupted by Mana under the influence of the doomsday creature in her body. The Watchers have the ability to see everyone's darkest desires and lay them bare, and while shackled, Mana was able to break Inuart.
If only I had more strength.
If only I had more strength, then I could protect Furiai.
Who's there?
I could protect her and make her my own.
Stop it!
Take her in my arms, surrender her to no man, my betrothed. She shall love only me.
Please stop!
All mine, Furiai, all mine, all mine, all mine. No man can have her, no man, not even Kaim.
She time and time again reminded your friend that he was weak, that he could never protect Firiai to begin with, and over again, she chided Inuart with the fact that the woman that he loved, her heart belonged to another. The next time we see Inuart, his eyes are glowing red and he is riding a black dragon. The same black dragon, coincidentally, who ate Kaim's parents all those years ago. He battles Kaim and under the influence of the red-eye virus is able to best his rival for the first time. Angelus is gravely wounded by the black dragon and Inuart kidnaps Vidya in order to deliver her to the cult. At this point, Inuart has also entered into a pact with the Black Dragon, and while it may seem benign having to give up his gift to Song, he really has lost the one thing that has made him himself, as well as the gift which led to Firiai accepting his proposal. Where the story goes from here is largely dependent on where you are in this game's branch system. In an interview leading up to the release of Drakengard 3, Taro revealed that during development of Drakengard, the director was repeatedly told that there was never going to be a follow-up to the game that they were working on, and given the hellscape that was the dev cycle, he believed it. As a result, Taro swung for the fences, not wanting to leave anything on the cutting room floor, and it was in this spirit that he would develop what has since become a mainstay of his games. A branching narrative structure that leaves room for more nuance and radically different endings. When you boot up Drakengard or get to the end of a chapter, you will be greeted with a screen asking you to play one of two modes, Story and Expedition. Story is exactly what you would expect it to be, but as you choose chapters, you will see that certain missions are inaccessible, with some only being unlocked after specific milestones in the plot are met, and some are only unlocked through meeting certain mission conditions. Expeditions, or just a fancy name for side missions, are typically what-if scenarios that are mostly there for you to slog through in order to level up, find weapons, and grind. But if you have any aspirations towards seeing everything that this game has to offer, you better dive into that mode too. On your first playthrough, even using language like that is a little convoluted as seeing all of this content does not require an entire playthrough, you will be on track for this game's ending A. Once you've seen that, missions that were previously unlocked will become available, and completing those will put you on track for seeing the next ending. And so on and so forth. In total, there are 5 endings to Drakengard, endings A through E. And while the extra missions can sometimes slot into previous parts of the story nicely and give a slight variation to the flow of the game, some slot in awkward ways that feel like they break the continuity, having characters show up in the narrative before they should have ever even met Kaim. These scenarios are functionally New Game Plus style encounters, even though, again, it is a little bit more nuanced than even that. But the context that is added to the world building is always a must to fully understand the breadth and depth of this narrative. And although future sequels hinge on which ending you are following, this model operates more like string theory or a timeline continuum than a simple, this ending is canon and this one never happened. In Branch A, you track down where Inuart has taken Firiai. You battle with your friend, now fully insane from the red-eye virus. You eventually best him and get into a fortress in the sky where Firiai has been taken. You battle your way to the Inner Sanctum and find that upon your arrival, the goddess is dead, and the arrival of the Watchers is imminent. However, in Branch A, Kaim, Angelus, and Bertole confront the child from hell, at which point she transforms herself into a giant that you have to battle with in the skies above the capital. It's bizarre as hell, it's a little goofy, but so were a lot of PS2 end bosses. And I can honestly say that I've never seen anything like it before or after. I really don't think many games could get away with making you beat up a 6-year-old within an inch of her life with Dragonfire. But we already know the lengths that the producer went through to get it all approved. Once she's beaten and back to normal size, she begs for Kaim to kill her, suddenly understanding everything that she has done. But Angelus wants her to be spared and to be held accountable for her crimes. And with the end of everything coming, Angelus, after growing fond of Kaim for some reason, and by proxy less judgmental of humanity, again for some reason, decides to sacrifice everything by becoming the next living seal. Bertole conducts the ritual, and the game ends with Angelus telling Kaim their name after hours of him referring to his companion as nothing but Dragon for hours at this point. And with those words of farewell, Angelus fades away with their sacrifice holding off the end of the world for another day. In Branch B, the end is nigh. In this route, Inuart cannot accept that Firiai is dead, and instead leans into the occult to try and save her. Right as the world is getting ready to end, places the dead goddess into a divine object known as a Seed of Resurrection, and it seemingly works, in a monkey paw sort of way. This branch ends with you fighting Firiai instead of Mana in this bizarre form. And although Kaim wins the fight, clones of this monstrosity born out of countless other seeds multiply through the sky, bringing on the end of humanity. It is in Branch C where we learn the most about Firiai and Kaim. Although hinted at throughout the game, it is here with Furia still alive once Kaim arrives that we see Mana at work manipulating the goddess. And similar to how she laid Inuart's deepest insecurities and desires bare, she does the same to Furia. And it is at this moment where we learn that Furia has had romantic and incestuous desires for her brother all along, and racked with the shame of having this revealed to him, and the disgust that he shows her when he learns this by turning away, Furia plunges a knife into her heart rather than live with what comes next. Inuart still tries to resurrect her in this branch, but Kaim and Angelus stop this action in this particular route, leaving him to die alongside her body at the foot of the Seeds of Resurrection. Mana calls upon the gods, asking them to allow the dragons to be used as the tools for the Watchers that they were always supposed to be, and with this, Mana is snacked on by an off-screen dragon. But with this decree, Angelus too is affected. She ends her pact with Kaim, and a boss battle with a corrupted and feral version of your friend ensues. But by then, the rest of the dragons are on their way to wipe out the rest of humanity. And this branch shows Kaim fighting to the very end as his guaranteed death approaches. Branch D, in some ways, is probably the most apt ending considering how wicked our party and their deeds are. Sirei is finally reunited with his sister, but recognizing what she has become, he uses Gollum to crush and kill her. But doing so destroys the fortress and crushes Inuart and Furia inside as Kaim and company are just able to get outside. And it is in Branch D where we get to finally see the end of the world as it has always been threatened. And it is bizarre. The Watchers take the form of a giant pregnant female form, pumping out giant floating baby after giant floating baby called the Grotesqueries. Ariosh, delighted by the sight of these giant infants, stays frozen in place calling to them, only to have the tables turned by having these creatures descend upon her to devour her flesh. Vertile does what you'd expect him to do, he cowers away and eventually runs off with his fate being largely unknown. And Leonard decides that enough is enough and ultimately decides to act as a distraction in order to allow Kaim, Angelus, and Sirei to run. In a noble but also very uncomfortable scene considering his proclivities, Leonard says goodbye to Sirei before killing his fairy pack partner, ending their contract in an explosive fashion. And in a final assault, Kaim brings Sirei within jumping distance to the Queen Watcher in order to sacrifice himself by living out a story that his mother used to tell him, using his power of lost time in order to trap both himself and the Watchers into a timeless void, as Kaim and Angelus are ripped apart above. And then there is Branch E, and Branch E is a lot, but even seeing it kind of serves as the make or break moment in this game for a lot of players, I'm sure. Once you've seen all the other endings, the condition for this final ending is unlocking all 65 of the game's weapons. And while you will certainly have gotten several through normal play, finding some in chests or after defeating certain enemies on the map, some of them are downright cruel in how you have to obtain them. First, a good chunk of them are tied to expedition missions. So if you've been avoiding those, you better get back to hacking and slashing. You've still got work to do. Some are tied to tackling levels by using specific paths, or even more bizarre, some only become available after spending 20 or so minutes on a map without defeating the last couple of enemies, leaving you to just hang out, hacking and slashing over and over again until the Grubhub driver decides to show up. And then, if you bumped down the difficulty to easy in order to make the enemies a little less spongy and Kaim a little less fragile during combat, you are going to have to bump that difficulty back up to normal and replay certain levels, because some weapons will just not show up on the easier difficulty. And real quick, when I bought this game back in 2004 after playing a demo for it on the disc included in volume 78 of the official PlayStation magazine, yes, I am that old, and yes, it was fucking awesome to get a magazine with a new demo disc dropped off in the mail every month. But when I played this game back then, it never once occurred to me to drop the difficulty once. And while Drakengard is not a difficult game, we've already discussed how monotonous it can be in terms of raw gameplay, so as far as difficulty is concerned, you have two choices. You can either slog through the entire experience and get the difficulty locked weapons up front, or you can drop it down to easy to make that slog a little less marshy, but then you will have to jump back and replay certain levels in order to get those items. In 2026, I took the path of least resistance, and if I had to, I'd do it all over again. On normal, damage isn't crazy, but it can be high, And when you factor in the bad camera and inconsistent enemy design, seriously, some archers will let you walk right up to them with no problem, and others will seemingly be overloaded on Adderall because they will dome your ass from across the map. And then there is a special place in hell for whoever decided to create the red version of these big shielded enemies in the fortress levels. I mean, you can't hit them with magic, and they just spawn in these hallways, and fuck, I'll just show you the footage. But no matter how you decide to get through this acquisition phase, you are going to have to go back to these maps and kill. And for me, this was the moment where I truly felt the madness Taro and team intended. Hours of going back into levels, hours of hacking and slashing in circles, hours of listening to that droning soundtrack that always seems to have this magical quality of coming off as grating at first, then genius, and then grating all over again, while you repeat sections of the title that you've already played for the third, fourth, or even fifth time. Here, it is where the killing felt the most mindless and the most pointless. And while this is bad design if the goal is fun, the point did get driven home. And although I will get into it in future videos on this series, this final grind before unlocking the final ending, it has become more or less a feature of Yoko Taro games. So playing this title for the second time 20 years after my first playthrough, I was more or less prepared for this grind. I knew which weapons were best for big burst damage, I knew which ones had the magic skills that I wanted to fully level up, and I knew which allies I could switch into for big screen clearing attacks in the instances that you're momentarily allowed to play as them. But believe me, this final roadblock in the game's progression is the drop-off point for most. In order to see that ending, you gotta embrace the grind. And once you do, it is time for ending E. And back in 2004, and arguably ever since, I do not think I've ever seen a more subversive ending to anything. Here, everything more or less occurs the same as it did in ending D. But instead of letting Sire be the one to take the queen head on, you and Angelus decide to fight the big watcher. But when you attempt to, a big portal in the sky opens up, taking Kaim, Angelus, and the Queen into a strange new realm, a faraway and strange place known as real-world Tokyo on the day of June 12, 2003, as the game transfers into a grayscaled and film-grained aesthetic. The Queen crashes into the heart of Tokyo and you descend upon it. But instead of fighting this boss like any other in this game by hacking and slashing or by engaging in a dogfight, instead this fight is fought through a Simon Says type rhythm game. The beast fires off a magic attack, and instead of shooting back fireballs, Angelus is forced to negate them with her own magic. White and black rings corresponding with light and heavy face buttons. The Queen is attempting to sing a song in order to end the world, and you are tasked with silencing her by playing a music mini-game. And while it starts off fair enough, just a white, black affair, you are expected to survive this for 2.5 minutes, and miss a note at the wrong time and you will not be able to recover as you get hit with a second one and it's lights out. And the last few measures of this song are ridiculous. And I'm gonna be honest, when I first beat this game shortly after it was released, this sequence was almost too much for me. The grind to get all the weapons was taxing, but the difficulty spike in suddenly a different genre unlike anything we've played up until this point, this sequence enraged me. I'd get within seconds of completing it, fuck up, and then it was back to the beginning of the fight. Back to the slow rhythm of the beginning of the song until it ramped back up into bullet hell, and then I would die over and over again. And I don't remember how long it ultimately took me, but I know days and maybe even a week passed. But eventually I memorized the final tricky section, and what waits for you on the other side of this already insane boss battle is equally, if not more, insane. You defeat the Queen, you triumph over trial and error, and you can finally put the controller down to let the last cutscene play out before the credits roll one final time. You watch the Queen crumble, her body parts turning into dust and breaking apart all over the city, and then it is just you and Angelus in the sky above Tokyo. And then this happens.
It is done.
After all of that, 2 fighter jets take you out with missile fire, and after the credits roll, you see Angelus impaled on the spire of the Tokyo Tower. Yoko Taro has stated in the past that this ending was seen internally as something of a joke ending. The whole thing, the rhythm game, and then the sudden anticlimactic end. But I would argue now, with everything that has passed since then, that this ending is perfect. Does it still feel a little out of left field? Absolutely. Is it still insane? Undoubtedly. But in a game that did so much to push you away from it throughout its entire runtime, and in a game that almost seemed to be hell-bent on making sure that you were constantly reminded of the pointlessness of the conflict and of this madness and of this violence, what better way to end this game? Lock it behind hours of mindless killing in order to get those prerequisite weapons. I mean, hour after hour of tedious combat for weapons that wouldn't even be used in the final fight. And if you were foolish enough to grind, or absolutely insane enough to do the unthinkable and make sure that every one of your weapons was maxed out before you went into this final conflict, doubly so then. The only reward for leaving that much carnage behind you was coming to a world where you didn't belong, and then being taken out by the cold military might of a much more deadly and alien force that you would have no time to identify. And as an extra bit of fuckery, when we think back to the fact that Drakengard was always supposed to be an Ace Combat competitor, a fantasy arcade flight game, how fitting that the genuine article happened to fly in at the last second and establish its dominance. Drakengard is an audacious game, a game that cares very little about you having a good time with it, a game in which you can almost feel the spite of the developers being passed to the player after being forced to change the scope again and again through development, a game where there are no heroes to root for and no hope to be found within its story. Every single one of these endings is more bizarre and unforgiving than the last, almost as if they are trying to tell the player, kid, it ain't gonna get much better than this. Look at what you've been playing. And while I remember laughing and yelling what the fuck at the TV as a 16-year-old when these final credits rolled, here on the other side of Yoko Taro's continued career, everything here takes on new meaning. Yoko Taro was told Drakengard would not have a sequel, so he hung out everything to dry here. But despite all of that, the game ultimately sold enough copies where the publisher was begging for another one. And even though there was a direct sequel, Taro did not direct Drakengard 2. The experience of being director was terrible, and he wanted as little to do with the sequel as possible. But everything that was laid out here, it ultimately served as the blueprint for what came after, and not just in Drakengard 2, but Nier and Nier sequel as well. Cruel worlds where your violence is never truly justified, games that almost always subvert the very genre that they are a part of, music that elevates even the most banal action into something thought-provoking and memorable, and storytelling that digs deep in order to analyze video games and why we play them, while simultaneously shining a bright light on the aspects of being a person that only serve to remind you how embarrassing of a prospect being human actually is. Drakengard may be a terrible game. It is not fun. It is not technically sound. But all that said, for what it set out to do, it is a goddamn masterpiece. Drakengard 2 would be released in just under 2 years after the first game hit the shelves. And true to his word, Taro was only minimally involved, working only as a video editor on that title. And although the next video in this series will cover Drakengard 2, I think it is important to state right here that it is a completely different experience by a much different crew. It still has its place in the universe of Drakengard, but because of the very nature of the branch system introduced into this game and Taro's eventual follow-ups, it only constitutes the continuation of one particular timeline, one particular snapshot of a larger universe. Drakengard 2 takes place after ending A straight-up sequel where the follow-up was treated as a quick A to B journey. But eventually Taro would come back to the universe that he was instrumental in creating, but it would be over 6 years later before the man returned to the director's chair. And although ending E may have been something ridiculous and something that served more as a cruel joke at the time of release than anything, it is in that ending where Taro focused his attention when expanding upon this game's universe, using its insanity as the perfect jumping off point for arguably his best game to date with 2010's Nier. But that will be the subject of a later video. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. And if you liked the video, please hit that little button so you can let me know. And if you want to leave a comment, please do. The algorithm seems to like that kind of thing, and I always try to stay active in the comment section. This was part 1 of my Draken Nier retrospective, and it is going to take quite some time for me to get around to all of it. I will be covering Drakengard 2, then Nier and its remaster, then Drakengard 3, which I've already stated on this channel multiple times is my favorite game of all time despite its flaws, and finally Automata. And while I will probably pay a little lip service to the side stuff like the stage plays, the books, and the spin-offs, it has always really been the games that I have locked in with the most. So that's the lane that I'm gonna mostly stay in. But having done an exhaustive retrospective on Alan Wake and the Remedy Connected Universe a while ago, I recognize how arduous it can be to hone in on multiple videos about one specific franchise back to back. So there will be breaks here and there to cleanse the palate. Because as good as they are and as much as I love them, playing nothing but Yoko Taro games for the next several months sounds like torture. If you want to see the rest of this retrospective, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss out. But until then, that's it for this video, and on to the next one. I hope to see you there too, but until we meet again, you are all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.